Go, Peter, you can start.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for the invitation to be a part of the Spiritism Talk series. And what we're going to talk about today is the prayer of Saint Francis of Assisi. This is a wonderful, popular prayer, and I want to start by just jumping in to read you the prayer. If you happen to be in a place where you're not multitasking, you can just close your eyes and take this in. That's ideal, but if you can't, that's fine too. But here is the prayer itself. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O Lord, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, it is in dying to self that we are born to eternal life.
Hey,
It's
Peter,
called,
thank you. Thank you for starting off with this beautiful prayer. And before you go ahead and get started with your words, insightful thoughts and words about this prayer, so you may want to recite it again. But I want to say, before we get started, everybody, welcome everyone. And just wanted to say how delighted all of us are from the United States Spiritist Federation to have participants from different parts of the world. And welcome, whether you're joining us live or watching this episode later. And I just want to say thank you also for being part of this session today that the United States Spirit, I'm tongue-tied, Peter, I'm so sorry. The United States Spiritist Federation holds every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So before Peter can talk, I just want to say it's such a pleasure to have him as to present. And the topic, as you know, is all about the prayer that he recited of St. Francis of Assisi. And Peter, I want you to feel this warm welcome from all of us. But before you begin, please allow me to introduce Peter for everyone. If you don't know him yet, Peter's a good friend, right, Peter? And is also an active worker at the Spiritist group Love and Light in Newark, New Jersey. He's also the current outreach director of the United States Spiritist Federation and also an active participant in the Tri-State Spiritist Federation. Peter has published beautiful, by the way, several beautiful children's book with his wife, Beti Rozen, and they do this through their company, Sem Fronteiras Press, as well as with other publishers in Brazil, Colombia, and in the US. And he has a long background in theater. He also holds an MFA in dramatic writing from New York University, and he is engaged professionally in commercial real estate. But Peter, before you start, I just wanted to remind everyone to please send your question at any time during this presentation using the chat window so that Peter can address your comments, your question at the end of his presentation. So now, without further ado, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you to the United States Spiritist Federation. It is a pleasure to be here. This presentation is about the prayer of St. Francis. And just to get started, I'm going to read the prayer. It's a short prayer. And if you are able to just take this in and you're not multitasking, great. but if not, lend me your ears, so to speak. Here's the prayer. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O Lord, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. It is in dying to self that we are born to eternal life. It's called the prayer St. Francis. And you can imagine that Francis tried to live by this in many ways. But before we go any further, I will point out that Francis actually did not write this prayer. This prayer first appeared in a Christian magazine in Paris called La Crochette in 1912. There is no evidence that this prayer existed before 1912. It was never found among the writings of St. Francis, and St. Francis did leave behind writings, by the way, even though he lived 800 years ago. But does that really take anything away from the title or the spirit of St. Francis in this prayer? Why should it? After all, if we think about all the words that we frequently quote and tribute to Jesus, which I'm going to do here, by the way, how many of those are actual words that Jesus actually said? Mark, the oldest of the four Gospels, was written a good 30 years after the time of the crucifixion. And then it was followed by Matthew and Luke, which were essentially copies of Mark. Then we have John near the end of the first century. It doesn't take anything away as to who actually wrote what. It's like Lao Tzu and the Buddha and Krishna, Confucius, all those great sages, philosophers. There's no signs of, nobody knows for sure what they actually said. So with that in mind, I also want to take a moment and talk about St. Francis. It's the poet, the prayer is mentioned in his name. Francis has been described as a great Christian, but he didn't start off that way. He was actually began as kind of a spoiled rich kid in the town of Assisi. But he wasn't really happy as he became a young adult. And this started to change when he went through a transformation. It began around the time when he was 20, when he was involved in a regional war between Assisi and nearby Perugia in central Italy. Francis was captured and held prisoner for a year. He was then released, and when he came back, he became very, very ill, and he almost died. But he recovered. And in recovering, he decided to devote himself to serving God. Francis founded the Order of the Friars Minor in 1208, so about 6 years after his illness. And he was a contemporary of Clare of Assisi and helped her to find in founding the Poor Clares, for instance. Now, finding your own religious order in the Middle Ages, Francis lived from 1182 to about 1226. Finding your own order in the Middle Ages was a little dangerous. It was potentially a very good way to get yourself burned at the stake because you're labeled as a heretic. So what did Francis do? Francis went to Rome and sought out the permission of Pope Innocent III, and he received it. After that, everything changed. Well, Francis was not trying to challenge the church. What he was really doing is it's kind of a back to basics approach. He was really touching very deeply with what it means to take Jesus into your heart, follow the teachings of Jesus, live by Jesus's example, and so forth. His order attracted many, many followers. And by the time Francis passed away in 1226, he had a sizable following. Within 2 years after his passing, he was already declared a saint. In the Spiritist books, a book from Emmanuel, one of his earlier ones, psychographed by Chico Xavier, it's called On the Way to the Light. Emmanuel mentions Francis, and he mentions that Francis was a reincarnation of one of the apostles of Jesus. We don't know who, but it's an intriguing thought nonetheless. So as I'm going to move forward in this presentation, what I'm going to do is essentially a exploration of the content of this prayer. But I want to start with this author, Eknath Easwaran, who was actually an Indian spiritual teacher who taught at UC Berkeley, was a Fulbright scholar, responsible for some wonderful translations of the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, which are fundamental to Hinduism, but also he translated the Dhammapada, which is some of the teachings of Buddha in Buddhism. But he also is believed to have taught the first college-level course on meditation back in the 1960s. So this was a subject he knew very well. Why am I mentioning him? Because at the beginning of this book, Passage Meditation, he mentions the prayer of St. Francis. He encourages anyone starting in meditation that this would be a good prayer to memorize and then cite it very slowly and really take it in. He points out that this prayer captures the total transformation of character. And even though in this presentation I'm going to lean a little bit more into the Christian references and certainly cite Spiritist references as well, this prayer in many ways is broad enough that you don't have to be a Christian to appreciate how this prayer can work. And Eknath Easwaran noticed that this prayer has a real universal appeal. It's a popular prayer. It's only 14 lines, and I would like to suggest that it's only in about 2 parts, really. Maybe you could argue it's 3 parts. By the way, I mentioned this prayer didn't exist before 1912, which is essentially true. It was, however, very popular during World War I, World War II. It's been cited by politicians, artists, etc. So it's a well-known prayer. Okay, let's jump in with the first line. Line number 1, Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. The lines that follow are all the ways in which we have certain negatives that we struggle with and what we can do to be an instrument of peace in overcoming those negatives. That is, the pathway to peace is to get through turmoil. And many of the suggestions made in this prayer are very much rooted in the fundamental teachings of Spiritism. But being an instrument of God's peace is not just some nice little platitude. It's actually fundamental to our existence. For instance, question 21 in the Spirit's book says that God is the very personification of love and charity. Well, you could also say that peace is the personification of love, and love and peace have a very symbiotic relationship with each other. In question 222, it says in the Spirit's book that God's love for everyone is equal. God does not practice favoritism. And this is essential in terms of understanding the nature of God's love. God loves everyone equally, and we all have an equal opportunity to be facilitators of God's peace. But also this idea that God's love is equal is connected to line number 2. Where there's hatred, let me sow love. Hatred can be an emotion within ourselves, or we could have hatred all around. Notice the way this sentence is phrased, where there is hatred. It's not distinguishing between whether it's within, internal, or external, because it's both, really. And then to sow love, to cultivate, to plant the seeds of love. Love is, in other words, part of our very nature. And this is captured in the gospel according to Spiritism, in talking that love is the divine essence. It's part of our very being, from the smallest to the greatest, that we have it. In other words, we're all endowed with the ability to have love. This doesn't mean, however, that hatred isn't a very strong and overwhelming emotion. Joanna de Angelis talks about this in her book, Wake Up and Be Happy. She points out we shouldn't be naive about hatred. Hatred is very strong. It's all around us. It's within ourselves. It has a very toxic attraction to it. It can spread like a pandemic. But what do we need to do? We need to do our best to try to combat the impulse to hate. When we think about love, love again is not selective. If God is love, God is peace, God is not being selective. Hatred, as strong of an emotion as it is by its nature temporary. And as a strong emotion, it can be softened over time. We can begin to dissolve hatred. We're not condemned to hate forever and ever and ever. And unlike love and peace, hatred is selective. We usually don't hate everything equally. We hate those people over there or that thing over there. So by its nature, hatred is not only temporary, but it's selective. But love is a constant. Line number 3, where there is injury, pardon. Injury meaning we've been hurt. And pardon, of course, meaning to forgive. So when we've been injured or we've done the injuring, which can easily happen, what about the role of forgiveness? In the book from Emmanuel, The Way, the Truth, and the Life, there's chapter 170 called Spiritual Control. And this chapter, this short chapter, points out that during the time of the passion of Jesus, it didn't change his very being. Even though he was betrayed by others, he was the object of a miscarriage of justice, he was the object of scorn and ignorance, etc. It didn't change his very being. In other words, Christianity, a core point in Christianity, is forgiveness. And if we think about it, Jesus's ministry of love would have collapsed like a house of cards if he became vindictive as a result. Emmanuel says here that the cross didn't change his serenity. In fact, he even asked forgiveness for the crowd's ignorance. That's a reference to the Gospel of Luke. That's the only gospel in which Jesus says, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do." So Jesus understood that when people are unjust, people carry out actions that warrant forgiveness. It's often done out of ignorance. And we always have to do our best to look at the injustices that either may be directed at us or that maybe we directed others as being an act of ignorance, spiritual ignorance. Line number 4, where there is doubt, faith. Doubt is a normal feeling. We have doubt. In fact, in the early stages of our spiritual progress, you could almost say it's necessary, because in order to overcome doubt, that's how we begin to develop a connection to faith. But what do we mean by faith? The well-known science writer Richard Dawkins, in a classic science book called The Selfish Gene, describes faith as a belief in anything, it doesn't really matter what it is, without any evidence. Well, that's true. If you have evidence for something, then you don't need faith. It's a fact. Makes sense. But does everything about the nature of our existence neatly fall within empirical evidence? No, not at all. So faith is also a very legitimate hypothesis for scientists. Many scientists start off with faith, that having the faith and the confidence that they'll solve something. Spiritism stresses, of course, that we should have faith based on reason. We need to question everything. We use our intellect, our moral understanding of things to deepen our faith. and that this is essential. We should not be afraid to question anything. We should not be afraid to discover later that maybe what we thought was true was really not true, and so forth. And all of this is one way in which we can put our trust in God in both the things that we do know about life and the things we don't know. So much of our life, to make an obvious point, is made up of what we know and what we don't know. It's just part of how it is. But faith, when we have faith, we've used our reason. We think something is true. We may not have absolute evidence of it, but we believe something is true. A lot of times, having that kind of faith in which we're not judging, doubting, etc., being, habitually pessimistic, a lot of times having faith will then lead us to unexpected answers in unexpected ways, which is the beauty of faith. But we should also remember that throughout all of that, we need to be involved and persistent. We need to do our part. We need to work. We need to keep trying to find solutions or answers, not forcing, but at the same time, we need to be proactive. This prayer in general is really a call to be proactive. Line number 5, where there is despair, hope. So what do we mean by despair? Well, despair is a very debilitating emotion in which we really feel that things are never going to change, things are never going to get better, we're stuck, in other words. But an important way to understand that, and I think this prayer encourages this, is in seeking out hope. It's a way of acknowledging that everything we go through has a purpose to it. Spiritism talks about this a lot, that everything we experience, we often experience trials, expiations, and so forth, but every challenge we go through, it may be discouraging, it may make us fall into moments of despair, but the real purpose of that experience is to transcend that despair by finding a way to seek hope. This does not mean you're denying your emotions. It means that you're also trying to understand that whatever the nature of our despair is, it, like the other emotions I've mentioned, the other negatives mentioned so far, are temporary in nature. One way to think about despair is there's another book by Emmanuel. There's a whole series of novels from Emmanuel, 2,000 years ago, 50 years later, Paul and Stephen, Hail Christ. There's also the book Renunciation, which I'll mention in a moment. But anyway, the first 4 books of Emmanuel are centered. The first one is set in the time of Jesus at the height of the Roman Empire. Hail Christ is in 3rd century Rome. So this is all during the early period of Christianity. And Hail Christ in particular is a book in which frequently the Christians of that time are objects of persecution, ridicule, etc. All the kinds of mistreatment that had caused anyone to lapse into despair. And yet these early Christians, many of them were grounded enough. They had the faith, but they also had the hope that they were able to transcend the inequities imposed on them. And this baffled the Romans. I mean, the Romans would look at these Christians and go, we're about to send these people to their death. Why are they so spiritual and so happy? I just don't get it. So that kind of ability to endure to the end, as Jesus said, the one who endures to the end will be saved. Line number 6, where there is hope, darkness, light. When we talk about darkness, it can mean all of the negatives that I've mentioned before: hatred, feeling injured, feeling doubt, being in moments of despair, etc. And darkness is both from within ourselves, but it's also can be a sense of darkness all around us. It has to do with the emotional atmosphere that we're currently in. Emotional darkness, well, a question we could ask about emotional darkness is it a choice? Well, that depends. A lot of times emotional darkness is unconscious. As Carl Jung points out, it's the shadow within ourselves. But as darkness continues, at what point do we then need to try to develop self-awareness and dissolve that darkness? Because the longer we stay in darkness, the longer it may become more of a choice. And if it's a conscious choice, then we're really getting ourselves into trouble. But if it's an unconscious choice, we're less responsible at the moment. But the way to counter darkness is the light. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Jesus's saying, do not hide a lamp under a basket. The lamp should be out so the light can be available for all to see. So when we talk about light, we're talking about emotional light. In this case, we're talking about consciousness. We're talking about tapping into our more positive qualities. Now, the line I just mentioned, which is from Sermon on the Mount, the line that follows that in Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verse 16, Jesus says, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Notice he says, let your light shine. In other words, we have it. We're equipped with it. It's like what I mentioned in the gospel about love. It's part of our very nature. We just have to bring it out and allow it to come out. But we have to allow this process to occur and get out of the way, essentially, over time. Also, this is saying that the more we do that, the more we give glory to your Father who is in heaven. One way to understand that maybe is that we are allowing God to flourish within ourselves. So light, of course, dissolves the darkness, is one of the main points here. Line number 7, where there's sadness, joy. Sadness is another very strong, very difficult emotion, often caused by loss, huge disappointments. If we're experiencing sadness, like the other negative emotions mentioned so far, it is in its nature temporary. It is healthier when we are experiencing sadness that we are willing to acknowledge it. In other words, don't put on a mask and pretend that you're happy when you're really not. Now, there may be certain instances where you do, in a public situation, you deliberately put on a strong front. That's fine as long as you know you're doing that. It's when you have no idea of how sad we really are that we can get ourselves into emotional trouble. But the thing about sadness is that, again, it's temporary. It's not meant to be imposed or prolonged. And if it is, it's cruel. If it's imposed on us, it's an act of cruelty by someone else. And if it's prolonged, in other words, we keep drawing out sadness within ourselves, we're being cruel to ourselves. Maybe we can't help it, but at the same time, it's an abnormal state to be in. But another thing to think about in the opposite of sadness, joy. In what way can we find ways to bring out a moment of joy during periods of sadness? For instance, there is a foundation called the Ica da Silva Foundation. This is based on a 13-year-old girl of that name who passed away from leukemia. Obviously very difficult for her family. After her passing, the family found a note from her in which she basically said she wanted to help others. So what did the family do? They created the Ica da Silva Foundation, which is dedicated to matching people with the right kind of bone marrow to be matches for bone marrow transplants for those who suffer from leukemia. That was back in 1992 that this foundation began. They're still going strong. They've helped many, many people, easily 1,000 by now. So this is an example where a sad moment from the past can be turned into something positive over the long run that is beneficial to many, many others. Okay, we have gotten through what I like to say is the halfway mark, or part 1 of this prayer. We have focused on the ways in which we can be instruments of peace by finding ways to confront hatred, injury, doubt, despair, darkness, and sadness. In a way, I'm going to use a simple, straightforward metaphor, a photography metaphor, which is the aperture of a lens. When when we're plagued by, or perhaps even choose to traffic in hatred, injury, doubt, despair, darkness, and sadness, it's as if our spiritual aperture is closed. We're filtering out possibilities. But when we open the aperture, we cultivate love as a way of addressing hate, pardon, faith, hope, light, and joy to counter the negatives. Then we're opening the aperture. Now, not to get too technical here, but when you close the aperture of a lens, there are benefits to that in photography. But for the purpose of what I'm saying, I'm talking about really the opening of our spiritual aperture as a way of allowing ourselves to be instruments of God's peace. But we have to do the work. And fundamental to this, and fundamental to this prayer, as mentioned before, is we have to be proactive. Okay, line number 8. Here again, the focus is starting to shift a little bit. O Lord, grant that I may not so much seek. In other words, God, let me change my focus a little bit. That's part of what it's saying. It's really suggesting that we change our focus by being a little more outwardly directed while we're also trying to change from within in all the ways mentioned in the previous slides. And one way to think about it is the difference between children versus adults. In developmental psychology, it's been pointed out, this was done by Alison Gopnik, who also teaches at UC Berkeley. Children, by their nature, are in explore mode. And in order to explore, to take in, to sort of absorb what's around us, we have to be open to do so. And then as we become adults, we more naturally exploit. Now, it's important to emphasize that when I say exploit, I don't mean that necessarily as a negative. It can, of course, be a negative. There are many adults that exploit things rather negatively. But we can also exploit things positively, meaning we use our resourcefulness, our intelligence to try to overcome the obstacles that we face. And we also have a duty to exploit positively in figuring out ways in which we can contribute. It may be local through our families, perhaps our communities if we're more involved that way. But in what way can we make a positive contribution? That's the act of exploiting. Now, children, there's overlap between these two to some degree, depending upon how old a child is, but you get the idea. So, what should we seek? Well, to be consoled as to console. In other words, we all at times need to be consoled, but we can't just stay there. What about our efforts to console others, to be outward, to be proactive? And if we do that, the more we seek outward means of helping, then we are helping ourselves at the same time. It's part of what Jesus said again in Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5-7, by the way. Jesus says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's the golden rule, and emphasis on the word do. It's a proactive statement. And in doing that, we're helping ourselves in the process. Line number 10, to be understood as to understand. Naturally, we all like it when people try to understand us. As children, egocentric children, it's our right to be the center of attention, to have people be focusing on us. But as we become more adults and go from being egocentric to world-centric, then we need to do our best to work on understanding. And the ability to understand is really part of our essential cognitive development. And imagine life if everybody made little or no effort to understand anyone else besides themselves. That would be a disaster. It would be enormously unstable. The actor Sterling K. Brown kind of touches on this idea that, we need to do our best to understand one another, even if we don't agree with that person. That's okay, but do we at least understand where that person's coming from? Again, this is a more world-centric view, the ability, it's going beyond dualism and being more open-minded, which we need to do. He also points out in this nice little quote that none of us have an objective experience of reality. We have our own points of view. Nobody has a total understanding of the nature of our existence. That's not possible. We have the limitations of our bodies, the way we perceive, and everything that factors into that limits what we understand, how we understand it, and so forth. Yes, that will change over time. But at the meantime, we're all operating with, the blinders are on. And everything that we experience, as he points out, is filtered through our own perspective. That's just part of the nature. But that doesn't mean that we're not capable of understanding one another's. And it's really a duty that we understand one another, as well as maturity. Line number 11. So we've asked for God, may I spend more time trying to console others instead of just worrying about being consoled? Can I spend more time trying to understand others instead of others always trying to understand me? Can I also make an effort to love others emotionally, emotional love in ways that we can express acts of love rather than just feeling as though everybody should always come to us? Joanna Angelus in the book Wake Up and Happy points out that there's in saying that love is the most powerful reality of life, that again, God is love. The personification of love is mentioned in the Spirit's book. She says here that love, radiates from God and it vitalizes, it energizes the universe. Not only does it do that, but it also maintains God's laws, the laws that come from God, in order that love is the maintenance, as it were, that allows harmony and balance for God's laws to continue. But we have to do our part in all of that. Another way to think about love is that in a partnership of any kind, marriage, etc., often one person is a little more advanced than the other and therefore has a little more responsibility. And she touches on this in this book about how that there's a duty on the part of those who are more aware of the benefits of love and the personification of love, being an instrument of God's love, God's peace, that when people have that ability, it's their job, they have a duty to try to help others. And an example that we could point to is, again, the novels from Emmanuel. I mentioned the others before. The book Renunciation is a little later. It's in 17th century Europe, mainly in France, Spain, and also the Americas. And in this book, there's a character named Anterno who, while he was alive, did some bad things. He betrayed people. He participates in a really bad lie that causes a lot of turmoil. And he winds up he was involved in the slave trade and so forth. He winds up getting himself killed because he crossed the wrong people. When he's back in the spirit world and he's feeling a little lost and is beginning to feel like he squandered his opportunities, a spirit of a woman named Margarita comes to him. And Margarita, when they were both incarnate, she was not his biological mother, but she was a surrogate mother to him. Well, there's a scene in this book where she tries to comfort him. She's honest with him, but she's basically making an effort to try to help him. This is an expression of love. She has more awareness of what love really is, and he doesn't. He hasn't quite come to terms with his own faults, but he's beginning to, and that's why she's there. She's trying to encourage him. And then, the book continues. I won't begin to get into the whole story of this book. There's not enough time. but it's a way in which love can be expressed, in which we have a duty to try to help others when we can. Now we're in line number 12 out of 14. It is in giving that we receive. Here again, the focus shifts a little bit. You could almost say this is like a third part, but I'm just going to make it part of part 2. It is in giving that we receive. In other words, charity. Again, Joanna de Angelis in this book, Wake Up, Be Happy, emphasizes that we have a duty to be proactive. And, this simple, blunt line, idleness is rust in the gears of life. We could sit around and do nothing, but we pay a huge price for it. And the more we are proactive in giving, that's when we really receive, in the act of helping others. For instance, is just mentioned in the book Renunciation. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. So we're echoing line number 3 in this prayer, talking about pardon from injury. The more we're able to forgive, we are then forgiven. In the Gospel According to Spiritism, it stresses that forgetting offenses is proper to the advanced soul. It's really stressing that we pay a huge price if we cannot forgive. Maybe it's, maybe it's a little fashionable these days to kind of traffic in being vindictive and not forgiving. Maybe humanity is like this all the time. But regardless of that, we pay a big price for it. As this book points out, it's no fun to be habitually paranoid and full of anger. Joanna de Angelis in her work stresses again and again and again the connection between our emotional health and our physical health. When we're full of negativity, anger, rage, hatred, etc., it will affect us, our physical health. We pay a price for it. But if we can forgive, if we can let go, if we can be more at peace with the things that happen, then we're more naturally in a state of being gentle, and we're also capable of acts of charity. Spiritism stresses without charity, there's no salvation. It's talking mainly about emotional charity versus financial charity. Financial sometimes, but definitely emotional charity, which can be carried out in a variety of ways. The last line, it is in dying to self that we are born to eternal life. So what does it mean, dying to self? It is a way in which we maybe have to let go of our identity as we've known it so far, when that identity has some major flaws to it. There's a lot of ways to think about this, but I want to go back to a manual, to 2 books I mentioned before, 2,000 Years Ago and Hail Christ. Both the character Tassianus from Hail Christ, who's a very proud Roman, privileged, really hostile to Christianity, and then Publius Lentulus, who was a proud Roman senator who was a contemporary of Jesus. Interestingly, both of these characters in these 2 books lose their eyesight. Now, they literally lose their eyesight, but if we think of this in terms of the content, the metaphorical themes of these 2 books, the losing of their eyesight is kind of in dying to self. Tassianus, for instance, rails against Christianity, but then a lot of things happen which he's starting to slowly but surely begin to question the nature of his identity. And even before he loses his eyesight, he has a moment where he's in front of his Roman gods, which he's done all of his life, and he's kind of looking at his Roman life, and he feels like there's something dead about it. And Publius Lentulus has a kind of similar experience, which gradually is going from being a proud, secure, influential Roman senator to eventually losing his identity in ways that ultimately are positive, because both of these individuals will move into a new transition that brings about eternal life. When we talk about eternal life, we're talking about a state of spiritual progress that is more sustainable. We're dissolving our own negativities, which is what this prayer is about. So, to wrap up, again, this prayer is about being proactive, about changing from within. We're not supposed to sit back and allow the miracle to just sort of happen somehow. We have to be involved, not forcing, but we have to be active in figuring out what can I do to overcome the difficult emotions that we all face, which can then make me an instrument of God's peace. But if I want to be a cynic for a moment, or let's say I'm a staunch materialist, I'm a nihilist by nature, and so forth, I may go, what difference does it make? We only live once. You got one shot in life, and that's it. Something Spiritism does not agree with at all. In fact, it's the exact opposite. If we really believe that we only live once, and that really, on some level, anything we do only matters up to a point, if everybody thought that way, could you imagine how unstable that would be? And you could then argue, why should we bother to improve? What's the purpose? What difference does it make? But if we think that life does continue, that there is a purpose, it changes everything about why we are here and why we should be making any effort at all to be better people. It's part of human instinct to progress. And we always have to ask ourselves that difficult question of what are the deeper reasons for why progress matters to humanity as much as it does. And as we perhaps operate from the perspective that we will continue, therefore everything that happens does count because life does continue. It's not just about action and reaction. That's a big part of it. It's not about being fearful of, well, if I'm not a good person, what's going to happen to me later? It's more about appreciating that we're part of a much longer process. We are that seed that has the ability to grow and to become something much greater. And I want to end with this quote that this prayer, the prayer of St. Francis, is really about self-realization. And Joanna de Angelis, in her book, Wake Up and Be Happy, is emphasizing that the more we work on self-realization, that we are we're applying the laws of life. What are some of the laws of life? Love, forgiveness, and service, all of which are mentioned a great deal in this book, that it is fundamental to why we're here. And the more we can realize all of these things as we realize ourselves, then we are indeed instruments of God's peace. This prayer is also referred to as a prayer of peace. And to repeat myself, where there's peace, there is the proliferation of love. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for sharing insightful reflections with all of us today. And I love that you brought so many great books for us to read, but not just read the book, but read and make those connections with the prayer of St. Francis is awesome. But for all of you, I know we got a lot of questions. Thank you so much. We want you to stay with us for the Q&A session that will begin shortly after a few announcements that I have to make. So the first one is just we, the United States Spiritist Federation, is inviting all of us to follow on social media channels. And by doing that, we'll stay updated on upcoming events and activities. There is a number there on the screen. And yes, we do have a bookstore. So don't forget to visit the USSF bookstore. You can find it, it's in the screen, but basically it is spiritistbooks.us. And you find a wide selection of Spiritist books, including several exciting new releases. I understand that in April, which marks the anniversary of the original release of the Spirit's book. And to honor Allan Kardec, the United States Spiritist Federation is proud to present the fifth the first, I'm sorry, not the fifth, the first English edition of a book that is amazing, not so well known, but the posthumous work, Selected Writings of Allan Kardec. Get your copy there. I did mine. And if you work with Spiritist youth, or if you are interested in any educational resources, please explore the Family, Youth, and Children Spiritist Education FIXI website, and that site is spiritismkids.us, and you find just amazing materials and ideas for educating our youth. And finally, let's take a moment to check out the Be My Hope app, which offers inspiring daily messages to uplift your spirit. It's available for free, and you can find it App Store, or Google Play. So back to you. Let's come back to your comments and questions, because we have reserved some time. And Peter, thank you for addressing those questions. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first one, as you mentioned, the prayer of St. Francis may not have been written by him, St. Francis, but expresses the spirit of his life and teachings. Can we discuss this further, Peter?
Well, Francis really devoted himself to helping the poor.
Yeah.
The order that he founded, they chose a life of poverty, so they were already trying to detach from the trappings of the material world.
Correct.
And as I mentioned, and I think it's worth repeating, Francis was not trying to topple the church. You know, that would happen 3 centuries later, not topple, but challenge the church through the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther in the early 1500s. In the case of Francis, he was saying, you know, we really need to take Jesus to heart. And there's a lot of ways to understand what that means. But, you know, when we think about there's common expressions like being healed by Jesus, allowing Jesus into our hearts, and so forth. Um, it's really about us confronting ourselves, our negative selves, which we all have. It's not, you know, it's not about being ashamed of our negative selves, but it is being aware of them and then working on what we can do. I, if I have a moment, I can tell you a quick story about Francis. I love this one. So Francis was with one of his friars, and one of his friars says to Francis, "So, Francis, how do you see yourself?" And Francis says, "I'm the biggest sinner of them all." And the friar is like really surprised, and he goes, "Oh, come on, Francis, there are some people around here a lot worse than you are. After all, we're talking Italy in the Middle Ages."
Yes.
But Francis's answer was, "I'm the biggest sinner because I know what I need to work on, and I still haven't done it."
Yeah.
Now, admittedly, the Francis and the early friars were pretty hard on themselves. But at the same time, it's that idea of holding ourselves accountable. So even if we aren't as rigid, maybe, or as a little overbearing as they might have been on themselves, are we holding ourselves accountable? And I think that's one of the important themes of this prayer. And I think Francis would have approved just from that perspective alone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, Peter, there's so many books and movies about the life of St. Francis, many iterations. And so if you haven't taken the time, just look, and you will find many beautiful renditions. But when you say that
Brother, Sun, and Sister Moon is one.
yes,
Early
yes.
70s. It's a fun movie. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. But when you said about he did not want to topple the church,
Mhm.
but there was a friction between the message of the early Christians, right, when Jesus came, the first 300 years, say, and
Yeah.
the church that the 1200s he came to face,
Right.
which that detachment is a big thing that he came with a very strong desire to
Yeah,
express through his life, right?
because the church, as many of our listeners probably know, the church was very powerful in the Middle
Yes.
Ages. I
Yeah.
mean, it went, once Rome adopted Christianity as the official religion in the fourth century,
Hmm.
the more the church grew, they had an enormous amount of land. They were in Italy, the popes were often competing with the kings for power and things like
Yeah.
that. So
Yeah.
Francis was quite aware of this, I think, but
Yeah.
he didn't do it by saying you guys are wrong. You know.
Yeah, he lived, right? He
Yeah.
lived that contradiction, that friction, if you
Yeah.
will. Yeah. So, highly recommend that if you haven't read or watched the movie, please do so. It's really inspiring.
Mhm.
So, Michael, hi, Michael. Thanks for your comments. He commented throughout
Oh,
your talk, Peter. So he says, "Would you speak to the need to live out this prayer ourselves as a source of blessing rather than just knowing the words of the prayer?" Beautiful question. Thank you so
okay.
much, Michael.
Let me think of a concrete example. All of the uh, many of the lines are giving us ways in which we can, overcome some of the struggles. So let's say line number 2, where there's hatred, let me sow love. Well, hatred's a strong word, but let's say we're in our families and maybe hatred is not quite the right word, but maybe somebody in our family really makes us angry
Yeah.
and gets us upset. How are we going to respond? Are we going to be angry back? Are we perhaps going to be hateful? Because sometimes people and families hate each other, obviously. Or can we find another way to respond? Can we not go down the well greased path of anger, hatred, retribution, etc.? So it's consciousness, but then you have to put that consciousness into practice. So if somebody in my family is really making me upset, if they are hurtful in some way, how am I going to respond? Can I do something positive that is really an act of love? Again, when we talk about love, we're talking about a variety of ways in which we can respond to people that are expressions of love. Um, Taking care of somebody in your family. Suppose you're in a situation where the person, that abusive so and so in your family is now reached old age and they need care. Can we be proactive in maybe trying to help them, even though they weren't the most ideal person in our lives before? Maybe, to put that mildly, maybe they were not very nice to us at all. The point is, are we going to return vindictiveness by being vindictive back? So,
Yeah, no, very, very good examples of that. And
mhm,
Michael, thank you for the question.
mhm,
So we have another one. Joanna de Angelis teaches us that hatred, speaking of hatred, right, is a barrier to happiness since you cannot cultivate peace while feeding hatred. Can you
mhm.
talk a bit about how happiness requires forgiveness?
Because forgiveness is about letting go.
Mhm.
And when we can't forgive, we're clinging to hatred. Spiritism talks a lot about detaching from emotional detachments that are harmful to us. Buddhism does the same thing. Really, Christianity, all the world's religions do this, I think. Um, when we, uh, in emphasizing forgiveness, by the way, Flavio Zanetti did a great presentation on this series about um, forgiveness, not fairly recently. But part of the point with forgiveness is um, you don't hang on to anger and rage. It doesn't mean you forget either. Um, if For those who know who the Amish are, they are a religious group in primarily settled in Pennsylvania. They're Anabaptist Protestant Christians, and back in 2006, there was a horrific incident in which a gunman held several school children hostage for about 40 minutes, 10 of them. He killed 6 of them and wounded the other 4, and one of them died many years later from the wounds. How did the Amish respond? They forgave. The gunman had a wife and children. They tried to console the family. They invited the wife to the funeral of one of the children. The father of the gunman, who was deeply upset, apparently cried on the shoulder of somebody from the Amish community for like an hour. In other words, the Amish didn't become spiteful. Many people would react with a great deal of upset and rage. They didn't deny the hurt, but they managed to transcend what we might regard as the normal eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth response.
Yeah, that level of forgiveness really references the talk that you mentioned before that Flavio Zanetti gave a few weeks ago. And it's really impressive, worthy of books or movies in case, right? When there's such a, how can you forgive this? But yes, we can. Yes, we can. Let's see if we have another question. Hey, Yasko. Yasko is asking us, and she says, "Hi, Peter. Nice talk from this prayer. Is it reasonable to foresee that suffering from our negative sentiments like hatred, despair, darkness is the start to develop virtues such as love, peace, light, etc. within us?"
Absolutely. Well, all of the negative emotions are just part of who we are. We're all, in stressing that we are born simple and ignorant, which is a common commentary in Spiritism. It's basically saying, look, we begin with those types of emotions, hatred, darkness, despair, etc. But the more we can begin to confront them, it's a process. We have to, it's not like we're going to suddenly eradicate hatred by next week or sadness by next week. It's not, but the more we become aware, gosh, I really am sad. Boy, I really am angry at so-and-so. Boy, I'm really having trouble forgiving here. I really have a lot of doubts about things. The more we're aware of these things, then we can start to explore those alternatives. And that's the point. I think Yas goes on to something very important point. It's the beginning. From those emotions that we all experience, which we're not so proud of, we can begin to see an alternative. And if everybody could do that, imagine how much this world would change. Because our progress of humanity as a whole begins with every single one of us. The real solution to transforming humanity is an inward spiritual transition. It's not going to be a political solution or anything like that. We have to work and start with ourselves. And then the more we do that, it goes out from there. And this prayer, I think, does a wonderful job of capturing that. Because again, it's emphasizing that we go out. We don't just stay. It's great if I'm sowing love, but if I don't interact with others in that process, finding ways to help others and so forth, then that's not the whole process. You have to go further with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question before we close today. And we have the question, the prayer emphasizes giving rather than receiving. Can we understand that the prayer teaches us to detach from our ego? Why is this important?
I believe in one of our programs together in psychology and spirituality.
We talked about this before, right?
A little plug. No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that's a little plug. So go see that show.
I see.
But no, the reason I mention it is because there's the difference between healthy ego and unhealthy ego. This is why I'm mentioning it, because we need, when we think of ego as having self-esteem, confidence, that's good. When we think of ego as being arrogant, closed off, stubborn, that's not so good. And this prayer tries to tackle the ways in which we can all be closed off, stubborn, unwilling to look inward. It's the famous question from the Spirit's book. The biggest obstacle to progress is pride and selfishness, because those are signs of the ego that's out of balance. Now, I guess in the beginnings of our spiritual journeys, we have an ego that really needs a lot of work.
Yeah.
But at the same time, as we progress spiritually, we have to have a healthier balance with our ego. So it is extremely important in terms of detaching from our negative ego. Not eradicating ego altogether. This gets into a much bigger question of what is the function of an ego. But for the purpose of this question and this prayer, we need to let go of our negative ego and replace it with a more balanced and healthy ego.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I just want to say that you find so much about the topic of ego and ego detachments, etc., in the psychological series by Joanna DeAngelis, but you made a remarkable relationship between wake up and be happy with this prayer. So thank you so much. And for everyone, it's a tiny little book. I would say if you've never read Joanna DeAngelis, maybe start with that book, because it is an invitation for us to understand what it is to be happy, and that's a promise for all of us. For all of us that are suffering, for all of us that are going through stuff, and we all are. This book really teaches us or tells us, guides us to get to our happy place. But anyways, Peter, thank you so very much, and I want to say thank you all of you who have joined us today, as well as on a weekly basis, right? And I appreciate you following the weekly Spiritism Talk series, because your engagement, your questions, your comments are super appreciated. They're very important as well. As you can see on the screen, we would like to invite you to join us again next Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern, for the next live session where Ana Moreno will explore the topic when life changes, destruction and renewal. Big topic, but we look forward to having all of you with us again. And Peter, before we close, maybe you want to share either a final remark or a closing prayer. We'd appreciate it.
Okay. I think I just want to repeat that real change happens when we start with ourselves, but that we also need to be able to share and help one another as we're also trying to help ourselves. And with that, let's do a closing prayer. Dear God, thank you for all that you have given us, the opportunities to grow and to learn. May we do our best to be instruments of your peace, to cultivate the light, to use our intelligence and our capacity for morality to develop. May this world be a place of peace, and may we continue to be examples of the good. Amen.